Questions? Yes.
I have a question about the forged epistles. Is there a different reason why we think each one of those is forged, or a general reason that sort of applies?
Well, both. And the best answer for that is I would suggest Art Ehrman's book Forged. It's written for lay people, and it basically just explains what why the consensus is what it is. He's just communicating what the scholarly positions are, and it's really good at communicating that to you. So it covers all the different forgeries in and out of the Bible as well. So, but the general, main, most significant example is that we can show from stylistic analysis that their authors aren't the same. So, for example, Ephesians and Colossians cannot have been written by the same author who wrote the other 7 letters because they're different sense length and choice of vocabulary, the use of adverbs, and like every conceivable aspect of style differs. So they can't have been written by the same one. And also they have different theology in them, so that's another different way as well. The pastorals, like 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus, are even more divergent. One of the most interesting examples is 1 and 2 Peter. They are believed by scholars to be both forgeries by different people, because we can show from stylistic analysis that they weren't even written by the same guy. Now, the interesting part about that is certainly 2 Peter is a forgery, as I mentioned there, because if it refers to 1 Peter, and it's not written by the same author as 1 Peter. You've worked through the logic and the way it could have been written by Peter. But that leaves open the possibility that 1 Peter is in this one. And the only argument that's been offered for it being a forgery is that Peter is depicted in the Gospels as being an uneducated kid. And in the book of Acts, it says he's illiterate. Therefore, he couldn't have written an elegant literary letter. I think that's way too cold. I think the Gospels are lying about that. It's extremely unlikely that Peter would be illiterate. He's almost certainly a highly educated rabbi. And you can tell this from the letters of Paul, the authentic letters of Paul, because if Paul was the only one of those apostles who could actually read the scriptures, who was actually an actual scholar, he would be using that as an argument against them all the time. That he's the one who actually has the skills and ability to read the scriptures. The fact that that never comes up as an argument and you never use it, it's always kind of at odds with them, trying to get them to accept his gospel, and he's kind of trying other tactics to get them to, and to get other people to side with him against them or whatever. The fact that that argument never comes up suggests to me pretty clearly that they had to be the same social status as him. They had to have the same education, have the same skills, the same ability to read the scriptures. And if you look at the history of religions, they're almost always originated by educated people in some fashion or other. And even another analogy is Islam. Muhammad is often claimed to have been illiterate, and therefore it's a miracle in the Quran. But he was the son of one of the most wealthiest and most successful mercantile families in Arabia at the time. It's incredibly unlikely that he was illiterate, right? But it makes his success more impressive to claim he was illiterate. So it's possible that Peter, or people later were claiming Peter was illiterate. It always been a miracle that he was chosen by God to do all these wonderful things, when in reality it is that he was an educated rabbi, just like everybody else. That's a possibility. The reason I bring that up is that if you accept that 1 Peter is an authentic letter of Peter, interestingly, it lacks historical Jesus. All the references to there being any events in Jesus' life are excerpts from the Old Testament. So if he talks about the crucifixion, he learns about the crucifixion from the scriptures. He doesn't refer to any eyewitness testimony or anything like that. And I talk about that in the book. So that's one point where I think I'm kind of in disagreement with the mainstream scholarship, but even if you agree with them that it's a forgery, then it's useless as evidence anyway. So, but yeah, there's a variety of arguments. Ehrman's book Forged. Yes?
Back in the days when I was an apologist, and kind of one of the things I still question today is the Josephus, James the brother of Christ, Jesus.
Yeah.
I read your snippets in Wikipedia on that, and it kind of opened up a whole new world.
Well, I have not written those, so I don't know what it is. Yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, I've published in the literature, so I'm just not aware of what they
They were talking about how you thought it was kind of made it sound like it was just an offhand thing you kind of thought about, but it was a marginal note. The brother of Jesus. And I'm curious overall in Josephus. I mean, that passage, it seems like by most scholars is accepted as completely authentic. And they're talking about this Jesus, the brother of Christ, instead of Jesus, the son of Amos, or whatever it was.
Yeah. Well, there are several scholars who either think it's an interpolation or agree that it might be. In fact, I would say probably the majority Yeah, oh yeah, sure. Because Paul refers to James being a brother of the Lord in Galatians 2, or Galatians 1. But that's one of those passages, two passages, where we don't know if it means a baptized Christian or not, or if it means an actual biological brother of Jesus. And that gets complicated in terms of the grammar of the Greek and the context of the argument. I talk about that in a sense of difficulty. So, but my article, which is the middle one there, is the one that is all about that, by the way. The entire paper is about it. It has a footnote on the other passage, which is more obviously an interpolation. But the one about James, this is the whole thing about it. And yeah, it almost certainly was originally a reference to Jesus, son of Damnius, who was actually in the story suddenly. And then what happened is the son of Damnius got replaced with the one called Christ. And it was probably done by accident, as I showed. We can even date when it occurred. It occurred sometime between 235 and 300 AD. Because we know that it wasn't in the manuscripts at a certain point, and then it suddenly was in the manuscripts at this point. And so we know it happened in this particular gap. And I talk about that in the article.
Are you saying you have manuscripts of Josephus that don't have that?
No, we have Origen, who doesn't reference it. And Origen tries to pour through Josephus to cite passages. He never cites this one. He cites a completely different passage and a completely different author and mistakenly says it's Josephus. Which means that he could not find this. He did not know of this passage being in Josephus. He knew of some other passage in some other author, which we can prove that that's the case. So the fact that Origen did not know about it, and in fact, this is the other interesting thing, is that it would be this exact same manuscript or a copy of that manuscript that got the interpolation out, because it's the same library. Origen was using the book of Josephus that didn't have it, because he couldn't find it then. And then about 50 years later, Eusebius has a copy of that book from the same library that suddenly has that inserted into it. So some copy was made in those 50 years that became the copy that Eusebius was using. And I give all the evidence and stuff in that article. Other questions? Way in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought about people like Joseph Atwill, their theories like that, or like John Montenegro. I'm pretty sure I already knew your answer, but
yeah, tinfoil hat. Yeah, there are people who know him personally who would agree with that as well. No, his theory is that Christianity and the New Testament are entirely forged and made up by Josephus in collusion with the Roman government in order to pacify the Jews. And that he can prove this with amazing coincidences that he finds between Josephus and the New Testament. Yeah, it's not, it's a bonkers theory. And he himself is just a guy who got a lot of money on the stock.
oh, I know that. I know.
And, yeah, and goes around pushing this theory.
I was just
He
wondering.
gets very angry when I point these things out. Incidentally, he wants to prove these amazing coincidences between Josephus and the New Testament, and so far as I can tell, he has no skills. He doesn't read Greek. He doesn't have any skills in the Greek language. So that tells you something. But,
Oh, speaking of,
go ahead.
speaking of bonkers theories, I was curious if there's any credence to the theory that the Bible is based on an astrological hybrid.
Yeah, what's called astrotheology is the view that the Bible, or really, let's say the Gospels in particular, that the Gospels use astrological allegories in their content, and that the origin of Christianity has some sort of astrological basis in it. I think that's, well, it's very unlikely to be the wrong word. It's possible astrology had some role to play in its origin, but the evidence is extensive that it was based on the scriptures and based on calculations and timelines in the scriptures. So you didn't need the astrology. And that it's all based on replacing the Jewish temple cult. That's the function of it. So it's not, if there's any role for astrotheology, it's minor and subsidiary. It's not the primary cause of the origin of Christianity. And there are various scholars who try to argue that there's all this astrological symbolism in the Gospels. There's a lot of looking at tea leaves, block kind of reading and stuff. I'm not convinced by it. It's not entirely implausible. For example, Mithraism, definitely caused by astrotheological reasons. But for that, we actually have direct evidence of these, right? Actual use of astrological symbols and things like that. For Christianity, I don't think a case can be made for it, and it's not needed to explain any aspect of Christianity that's fundamental to the religion. So, yeah.
Hi there. Can you expand a little bit upon, I saw that you made the sort of stronger connections with Osiris and that sort of thing, but with these sort of half-baked theories out there with the little Zeitgeist and religionist connections, can you expand upon
Yeah.
I see it's kind of pervasive, and I wonder
Yes.
if it's pervasive in academia or
No.
no.
No, and in fact, this is a big problem I have because it's so pervasive
Yeah.
that it's almost the only version of it that the academics, that scholars and professors encounter. And so they encounter it, it's plainly ridiculous as it is. And so they think this whole theory is ridiculous. And so I have to fight against that.
It kind of undermines.
So they're doing the whole movement a disservice. If they really want this to be taken seriously by academics, they're hurting the cause by making it harder for me to persuade academics to pay attention to this theory. Yeah, so there's a lot of that crank stuff going around. And what she was referring to is a movie zeitgeist. That's a weird conspiracy-based documentary thing. That's based on others, these sort of amateur outside academia scholars, based on astrotheological theories and the idea that it's based on Horus and everything, which confuses Osiris with Horus, and so that's a whole other problematic thing. A lot of the parallels that are claimed don't hold up when you look at the original evidence and so on. And unfortunately, that same source affected Bill Maher when he did Religulous. And I was so bummed by that because he didn't need to do that. He'd gone to a professor who was sympathetic to the idea, he could have given him the correct list of information. So instead, when he does the Jesus myth theory, he lists all the Horus stuff, and I was like, oh, no, that's the worst.
That's driving me
It's making
crazy.
this look ridiculous. He could have done that with correct information that would have been just as, like, holy shit, and would have stood up. And so I'm disappointed by that. But what can he do? He's not an expert, so how would he know? But still. Yeah.
So given, I guess, maybe 100, 200,000 years from now, where do you think it's going to take off? Because I see this like current trend in transition from more story-based, like oral literature being passed down to like this fundamentalist RAFT, or this is true, this is true, this is true, and now it's like politics.
Yeah.
So do you think that Mormonism will take off, or do you see Christianity changing to this like strict fundamentalist, every single story is true? What do you?
Counterfactual history is always challenging.
Especially with like Islam, because
Well, I don't know enough about the Islamic world to make predictions for that. For the Western world, we're already seeing secularization as a major factor in Europe, and America is already starting to show the same signs and trends of secularization that Europe was doing like 20, 30, 40 years ago. So we're slow, we're behind the game, but we're going to be going in the same direction. But what happened in Europe is you do still have a small fringe group of fundamentalists, right? They still exist, fundamentalist Christians, I mean. That's still a thing. But the group shrinks in both sides of influence and power, right? And I think that's what we're going to see. Is we'll probably never get rid of the fundamentalists. There'll always be, these lunatics on a compound somewhere or whatever, doing this kind of stuff. So you'll always have that. And the religion may transform in various ways, who knows. But what's interesting to me, the more interesting question is, if academics come to the conclusion that this is a plausible theory, or even like that it's correct one way or the other, I think at least they'll be agnosticism. Well, it could be this, it could be the other, I'm not sure. If it comes to that, what will be the response of Christianity, and not fundamentalist Christianity, which you can totally predict. We'll just deny it all, just like creationism versus evolution. What's more interesting is what will the liberal Christians do with it? Because liberal Christianity is larger and actually has already been dealing with a lot of other blows to the faith, like accepting that there's forgeries in the New Testament, accepting that it's in the Gospels, and so on. There's two things that can happen. One is the Shelby Spong approach, which is that it doesn't matter whether any of it's true. It's just all allegory anyway. It's the allegory that's important. It's the symbol about the moral teachings and all that stuff. So it doesn't matter whether God existed. Jesus didn't exist. It doesn't matter. And interestingly, one of the professors who's an actual expert in the field who advocates the Jesus myth theory is Thomas Brody. He's a Catholic priest and remains a Catholic priest, and he argues in his book that Catholicism can still be true without a historical Jesus, because it's all about the message. It's not about the mystical plan. I think that's a stretch. I don't see the church buying into that, but I can see how it become popular among the lay Catholicism. The same way lay people in America don't listen to the Pope and anything else either. But also there's another direction we can go, which is something more of like the, I can't think of an example, there are some of that. try to go back to the original Christianity. So the point of this, of course, is that the upshot of the theory is that Christianity began with Jesus' revelatory being. Now, we think that means that there's no revelatory being, they just thought there was. But if you're a Christian, you can say, well, actually, maybe that was true. Maybe there really was a revelatory archangel named Jesus who really was talking to the apostles from heaven. And maybe he really was crucified by the devil and now was based on this. And you can actually revive the original cult and have a whole religion based on this. And to say in the pit of the gospel, they're just allegories for the whole message of the gospel. They're not literal histories. That would be a more sophisticated way to go to it. And I would be very curious if you're saying like 1,000 years from now, if there is such a cult that the Christians go back to that and are preaching God. I'd be curious to see. I don't know what the odds are of that happening.
Just so it's what fascinates me with the throughout, there's just a need that humans have for some sort of sacred, something sacred. Something
Yeah, and the way they interpret it, like you were suggesting, like,
to find out the meaning, like the meaninglessness of life.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
but also the way, like, when they treat text literally or symbolically, and we were mentioning that earlier. A lot of Christians are already on board with the symbolic interpretation of the gospel, so I see that as a trend already. Let's see, one more question, there are a bunch.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the angel Moroni, Jesus, existed somewhat in your text. Can you say specifically what a Jew now or a Jew at that time would have understood that kind of angel Moroni Jesus to be?
You mean the angel Jesus that Philo?
Yeah, the Jesus that gave the revelation.
Right. Not Paul Moroni. Well, I don't know what modern Judaism does with its ancient angelology and demonology. In antiquity, the Jews were all about angels and demons. Like they had an entire pantheon of angels and demons, and they had this entire view of how the cosmos worked that doesn't make any sense now. Interestingly, it doesn't make any sense now because of modern science, but the cosmology that they were preaching in the time of the origin of Christianity was based on the science of the time. In fact, that's why it differs from the Old Testament view. The Old Testament view was that flat earth, you have pillars holding up heaven, and heaven is this giant tin dome. Not heaven, but the firmament is this giant tin dome, and heaven is above it, and it's the waters above, and there's little windows that go and open it, and it makes rain come out. And it's just like this really primitive, ridiculous view. But that was written before Aristotle and the Hellenistic scientists of the region discovered all sorts of things like the Earth is a sphere and the moon is 200,000 miles away, and all of these other things. Planets are different distances, they're not all on the same plane. And these scientific discoveries, which were true, more or less, became adopted by Jews constructing their cosmology. So they reimagined what the Bible was referring to as being a spherical Earth with different spheres of heaven, and you had the first sphere is the moon, which is the closest one, which is still 200,000 miles away, so it's a vast area. And that was the region that was subject to decay and corruption, and everything above that was perfect and in control, in God's control. And so the devil and Satan were the ones who ruined everything below the moon, and God protects the rest of the heavens. And all he has to do is take over that one last bit. And so that's their whole imagining of it. But of course, it's geocentric. It's based on space being full of stuff and not a vacuum. I mean, there's like all kinds of things that don't make sense on modern science, but it made sense the way they
Keeping all these supernatural beings that interact with humanity.
Oh yes, absolutely. I could document and discuss that extensively in the book. That is one of the background knowledge people often don't have. Is this idea that they believe the whole universe is inhabited by beings, and that you communicate with them, and they travel, and there's all kinds of stuff. Different way of seeing the world than we see it now. Way in the back,
You recommended a great book by Randall Hell. And another book he proposes that Luke and Acts is written by a woman. Has that idea received any traction?
Not traction per se. It's just cited as a possibility in the literature now. I don't think his case holds up. In terms of probability, it's extremely improbable. It's not impossible. It's extremely improbable, especially for the Christian church, for various reasons. Because when Luke was being written at that time, it was already going back to the old stratified social system where women are inferior to men. When we had it earlier, like at the time of Paul was trying to create an egalitarian society where men and women were more like equals. But the religion he was preaching is entirely different from the religion you get, and not entirely different, in many respects different from the religion you get by the time of Luke, which is about 100 years later.
apostles, one, and what said that he would know his knowledge of Jesus from a scripture, so what kind of scriptures was he actually reading?
Ooh, those are good questions. The first one is yes. Paul only knows Peter and James and John, for example, as apostles, just like him, not as disciples. He has no knowledge of that. He does, if it's authentic, he does refer to there being a quorum of 12, there being a 12, but it isn't called the disciples. And what they are is just the first apostles. Paul is a latecomer, so they're just the apostles before him. So yes, he does refer to them, but not as disciples.
Real people?
Say again?
Real people?
Yes, almost certainly. Yeah. If we buy that Paul's letters, the authentic letters actually are not completely fabricated. He's talking about meeting these people, and he's writing to people who know these people and trying to tell them about their actions. So yes, almost certainly. But the other question was, remind me again.
What scriptures?
What scriptures? Yes. That's one of the things that a lot of scholars get wrong. When I document essentially in the book, so that they don't. The earliest Christians were using a different set of scriptures than exists now. So their so-called Old Testament had stuff in it that no longer survives. Also, the books they had, that are books that are in our Bible today, said different things than they say now. So they were working from a different set of scriptures with the different passages and stuff. So when, for example, when Matthew says that the scriptures predict that Christ will be a Nazarene, literally says Nazorei, which that's a whole other story, but almost certainly he's true. He said he's right. There probably was a scripture that said that. It just didn't survive. It didn't survive in any of the versions we have. One of the most interesting examples I talk about in the book is 1 Clement. It's a letter supposedly written in the 90s, I don't think it was in the 60s, but either way, it's a letter outside the Bible. It's in some Bibles in the Middle East and things like that. It's a letter outside the Bible, but it quotes scripture as scripture says. As the scriptures say, and it gives a long big quote. We have no idea where they're getting it from. It doesn't exist in any of the scriptures that we have. And so this is the Christians are basing their religion on scriptures that we don't have now, and various things like that. So you've got to keep that in mind. But some of the scriptures that we have that are not in the Old Testament, that they regard as scriptures, we have some of those as well, like the Wisdom of Solomon and the Book of Enoch are two very important scriptures for the Christians. Very foundational, fundamental. They told them using a lot in their earliest brains.
So would they have been reading any writings about the man Jesus, or would he just have gotten word of mouth information?
Regarding the lore about the Archangel Jesus that Philo brings up, it's possible, yeah, that there were books about it. It's possible that there were lost scriptures about it. But it appears that, for example, Philo seems to be saying that there were Jews who were interpreting scriptures into it, because all the references to Joshua in the Old Testament are that Jesus is the exact same name. And so if you were inclined to think that God was writing secret messages about your Jesus, every passage about Joshua anywhere in the Old Testament is a game for a possible secret message. So you could reconstruct all kinds of things like that. And Zechariah 3 and 6 give you almost the entire Archangel of Jesus idea out of it if you read it a certain way. So it's entirely possible that Paul's just getting it out of Zechariah, and it's possible he learned that through lore from other rabbis.
Paul was the missionary to the non-Jews. So how was he taking information about Jesus and his message to the non-Jews? Do we have to use the Old Testament scriptures to do that?
He would use the Greek, the Greek translation of them. It's a bit incorrect to say that he was the apostle to the Gentiles. That was an agreement that was made long after he'd already been evangelized. Because he was butting up against the original sect, which said you had to be a Jew to be a Christian. So you had to cut off a piece of the penis and follow. Whereas Paul was saying he didn't have to do that. And so he was actually creating churches that had both Jewish members and Christian and non-Jewish members.
seems to me like the Bible is one giant game of telephone.
Well, yeah. That's what they thought for the Gospels, for example. I don't think that's the case. I think the Gospel authors are sitting down and inventing it whole cloth. I don't think it's the end of a telephone game. I think it's their invention entirely. What's that?
Beginning of the telephone.
The beginning of the telephone game, I guess. Yeah. People want questions. So wait, you have an next one.
Yeah, I'm curious, talking about the telephone and the creation of this, the Essenes and their teachings on the teacher of righteousness and their books, what kind of an influence might they have had on early Christianity?
Yeah, I talk about that in the book. It's not that sect, there are many other sects as well that show similarities to Christianity. So it looks like Christianity as a Jewish sect is influenced by many sects. The Essenes have a lot of similarities to them. We don't have enough literature to definitively link them in any way. So there's lots of tantalizing hints, there's a lot of literature about this, so you can explore it further. And I think it's highly likely that Christianity was heavily influenced by one or another Essene cult, or may have even originated within the Essenes. We can't prove that. There's a lot of different ideas can cross different sects, so it doesn't necessarily mean they came from that, but yeah, there are parallels there. Yeah.
Earlier in the talk, you said Mark couldn't have written before about 70 AD. Could you remind us why it was?
Well, the big reason is that Mark 13 he talks about the Romans, or not the Romans specifically, the temple being destroyed. So there's two explanations to that. One is Jesus was a supernatural psychic and predicted the future, and the other is that Mark is writing after the temple. But there are other hints in the text as well, like that one, like the Hamilton Kelly analysis of the fig tree thing is kind of a confirmation of that. It's clear that he's aware that the temple cult has been withered to the very roots, which means it's been destroyed. So there are other hints throughout Mark where that seems to be the case. Another piece of evidence in Mark that's unrelated to that is that the crucifixion narrative, the whole trial and crucifixion narrative, has 20 similarities to another Jesus narrative called Jesus ben Ananias, who lived and died in the 60s AD. So it has no connection to Christianity. He's not the Jesus who originated Christianity, but there was a story that fit very well with Mark wanted to write down. He adapted that story. It looks like he adapted that story to write his story about his Jesus. Now that story first appears in Josephus' Jewish War, which was published in 75 AD. Now, at the very least, of course, the story itself, even if you got it from someone other than Josephus, the guy died in 66 or something, so that shows you that it has to be after that. But I think it's almost certain that the story comes from Josephus, right? So I think Mark is using the Jewish Wars of Josephus, so I think that would put him post-75. So, for example.
Only about 2 more questions, folks?
Right.
Except for one real quick thing. Can you put the Zechariah 3:6, the other one was there? So, 3 more questions. That was one of them.
2 more.
Yeah, that's one.
Zechariah's in there.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to be able to reference.
Yeah. Zechariah 3 and 6. But do you want the final references?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's right there.
Thank you. And 2 more questions.
Yeah, 2 more and then we'll go. Oh, no, 2 more and then settle.
Yes. 2 more questions, then we're going to do a little meet and greet over the corner. And book signing, I'll take $10 for every book signing you do. So just hand me the money. Fine. Work out a deal. But
But I take, by the way, I take credit card as well. So personal check, cash, credit card, all that. So 2 more. You picked. So,
Yeah,
yes.
now do most scholars, lay scholars, how do they take the story of Jesus' crucifixion with all of the events surrounding it? You know, the whole earth darkened and there was earthquakes and bizarre events. Because, I mean, so many Christians take it literally. Who sees these things? But it's like, that whole thing is just so freaking ridiculous.
Yes.
But the Christians teach their children. But if anything happened, you would obviously see, you could see records of that happening with real historians. And you don't see it. But there are actual books from Christian historians who say that,
everybody agrees in academia that those are made of stones. So in fact, they fully concede that most of the Gospels are made up. So for them, the question isn't whether the Gospels are true or not. The question is, can you get at the truth through the fiction? So can you extract nuggets of truth from them? And that's the challenge that they see as being faced with them. And that's pretty much uniform view throughout the field.
So why are they still teaching some pastors that some of the earthquake and stuff like that is actually recorded with some stories?
Yeah, well, that's the fundamentalists, right?
I mean, they're still there teaching them.
They don't have their own stones, essentially. So, they do it themselves. All right, one more. That was you, yes.
Yeah. Of all the characters that you've been talking about, that wrote the scriptures and so on and so forth, which ones actually existed and which ones are totally made up? And out of those, which ones are most responsible for forming the religion we have today? Because obviously there wasn't a Jesus.
Well, I can't show that any of the others didn't exist in terms of apostles.
Okay.
So, and we know, for example, Paul, Peter, James, and John, they probably existed. Paul refers to them when he's talking about them. So, there were those apostles, at the very least.
Apostles to who though? There was no Jesus.
Yes, they're apostles of the Revelation.
Okay. Of the religion only.
Yeah,
Not
right.
of-
Oh, yes, that's what they did. They were the originators. Peter would be the first one to have started.
Okay.
So there are some other characters in the Bible or in the Old Testament Gospels that you can show are fictional, but they're not relevant to the origins of Christianity. They're just allegories within the story. If you're interested in that, it's chapter 10.
So it's basically
Jesus
Peter
served.
founded whatever the church is today.
Right.